Teens Talk Politics. I'm Michaela Kells.
And I'm Richard Colwell.
And today we're sitting down with Wisconsin's Secretary of State, Doug Follette.
Hello folks, good to be here with you all.
So our first question is, what specific task constitutes the majority of your job?
Well, I'm the Secretary of State, so I'm elected by all the people of Wisconsin, and I'm given the duty of managing the office and working with my co-workers and trying to make sure everything runs fine. And then I answer questions, I get emails, and I travel around the state. I get invited to speak at different places around the state. And so that's basically my job as the manager of the Office of Secretary of State.
Okay, our second question is, how did the changes in the governor's budget affect your office and your job?
Well, it was drastic, and I heard about it when I saw the first budget coming out, and I complained very strongly. I wrote to the governor, I wrote to the Joint Finance Committee and told them that the changes they were making, and there's two basic changes we'll talk about, would be a disaster. It would be a train wreck, is what I said. And the two changes were, first, they moved the office from a very accessible office on Mifflin Street, right across from the Capitol, with a big sign on the window, Secretary of State's office, so people could find it. And we had about 4,000 square feet to store all the important records, like the kinds you see behind me, but many, many more. And I had 3 full-time workers helping me process the documents we needed to process. They moved it to the basement where we're sitting now, and we only have 600 square feet here. So we had a great problem with what to do with all the records. And it was a real disaster in many ways. But the most critical thing that's happened now is only 1 staff person instead of 3. We can't get the work done, and we're falling behind. So at the moment, we're, I think, 6 or 7 days behind. So the mail we got yesterday won't be processed for about a week and a half. And we're still working on mail from back in July. So those are the two changes. And how it affected the office, it was a train wreck. It was a very, very bad thing.
All right, our next question is, do you believe being in your position for 30 years has helped or hurt your department?
Well, I think it's helped for me to have the experience to know how to run the office. I don't think 30 years is required. I think I learned that in the first 4, 5, or 6 years. The office has changed a great deal, and the changes have been for the worse. Because when I was first elected, I had a staff of over 50 people, and we handled a lot of important activities. For example, trademarks, incorporations, Uniform Commercial Code, which most people don't know about, but it's very important, and other activities which relate to the business community. And the office was kind of stale and old-fashioned. So I went into there to modernize it. And I'm a scientist, I understand technology, so we put in computers. There were no computers there. We got more modern equipment, and I turned the office into one of the best Secretary of State's office in the country. Then what happened, Governor Thompson, when he got the power to control the legislature, he wanted to take things away from other elected people and take them under his control. So Governor Thompson got the legislature, which was all Republican at that time, to remove many of those duties, corporations, trademarks, Uniform Commercial Code, for example, and put them in a brand new agency called DFI, Department of Financial Institutions, which even today, what, 15 years later, people call here looking for it. And we have to say, you got to go to DFI. What's DFI? Most states don't have a DFI. All across the country, secretaries of state have those duties. And I've argued for years now they should return them to the Secretary of State. Not because of Doug Follette, but because that's what's best for Wisconsin. If we're going to do business and we're going to be competitive, we need to make it easy for people to get a trademark or form a new business. And if they have to look around for DFI, that's a problem. So the office has changed a great deal during the years I've been here. And again, not for the better. And I've argued that they should change that, and I hope they sometimes will.
Okay, our next few questions are regarding authentications and apostilles. So first, can you explain what authentications and apostilles are, and what types of forms or documents require these?
Well, they are a certification that is required under the Hague Convention. The Hague is a city in Holland, as you probably know, And it's where a lot of international people meet for discussions about business situations. And many years ago, they passed this convention to facilitate international activities. And so just a few of the activities which come to this office on a regular basis would be someone wanting to study abroad. A young woman came in a few days ago who was going to Spain to spend a year in Spain going to school. And the documents from the university had to be authenticated for her. And of course there was a problem because we were so far behind, and she's still waiting for them now. We hope to get to them soon. Another activity is if you want to adopt a child. People want to adopt a baby in a foreign country, and the foreign country requires documentation, and that documentation has to have an apostille put on it. Another is international business, and that's very important for Wisconsin. We have millions of dollars of international trade where Wisconsin companies are working overseas, and they have to get these documents authenticated for their work. The last one I can think of quickly, which is kind of strange, is if you want to ship a dead body overseas. And that actually happened on Wednesday. Someone had died and they had to go home, back to where they lived, so they had to come in and get the documentation for that shipment with an apostille. Now what is the difference? Well, an apostille, which is a kind of a strange word, under the Hague Convention, these are the countries that have signed the Hague Convention, and it's a long list. And all of those countries, if the documentation is required, they get an apostille, which looks like this. And we look at their document, we make sure it's correct, make sure it's all proper, then we attach this to their document and they have an apostille. Now countries that have not signed the Hague Convention, they get an authentication because they can't get the apostille, so they get an authentication, which is basically the same process. We look at the documents and we make sure they're correct, and we attach an authentication, which works fine for the countries they're going to, which have not signed the Hague Convention.
Okay, so going back to how you said there's been some dramatic changes to your department. So with those changes, do you feel that the Secretary of State is a position that's essential to state government?
Well, that brings up a big philosophical question, and that's how we should manage our government. And I've felt always, and why I ran for office originally, that elected people should run our government, whether it's a school board or a congressperson or the president or the Secretary of State. I think elected men and women are more responsive because they have to go out and shake hands and meet people and talk to people, and then if they get elected, people know who they are. People know who Doug Follette is. I mean, not everybody, but certainly a lot of people, particularly those that need the services, they know Doug Follette, or they know Governor Walker, or they know school board member Sally Smith, or whatever. And that's why I believe so strongly that we should elect our leaders. Well, the Secretary of State's office has had a lot of duties removed from it by people who wanted power for themselves. And that's made it difficult because those duties are now under appointed bureaucrats. No one knows who runs DFI, I bet. If you go out and talk on the street, I bet more people will know who Doug Follette is than who the person in charge of DFI, where these duties have been moved to. So as I said earlier, I think the right thing to do, and it's important for Wisconsin's future, is to return those duties to an elected official, like they are in all across the United States.
Thank you. And our next question is, can you please explain the process by which a bill becomes an act within our state? So basically, what is the process start to finish, and what role does your office play in the legislation making process?
Well, making a new law is a fairly complicated procedure, and I'll explain it. It happens in Wisconsin, it happens in most states, and in Washington, D.C. it's a similar process. If someone has an idea for a new law, they introduce a bill. It could be in the Senate or it could be in the Assembly, and it gets a number, Senate Bill 24 or whatever. And that bill then is introduced with the sponsor's name and sometimes co-sponsors. They may get other people to sign that they support this idea. Then, if it's possible, it gets assigned to a committee. And there's lots of places for this to get stuck. But assuming the idea is a pretty good idea and people like it, it would be assigned to a committee. depending on what it's about, whether it's about education or whether it's about taxes, it goes to that committee. Then that committee has a chair, and that chair can either put it in a drawer and forget about it, or they can have a hearing. And again, if it's a good idea, or if it has support, there'd be a public hearing. At that public hearing, people can speak and say, it's a good idea, it's a bad idea, you ought to make a change this. And then if it gets enough support, that committee would have a vote, and they would vote on that bill. And if it gets a majority vote, then it would go to the other house, from the Senate to the Assembly. In the Assembly, the same thing happens. It goes to committee, they have a hearing, and if it gets enough votes, it's passed to that Assembly. If it gets through both of those committees, then it goes to what's called a Rules Committee, and that committee decides what goes to the floor for a vote of the entire Senate or Assembly. And again, if it gets proper support, it gets scheduled for a vote, then let's go to the Senate, because it was a Senate bill, then the Senate would have a discussion of it, could last 5 minutes or last 10 hours, where they debate this idea, and then they vote. If it passes, then it goes to the other house, the Assembly, and the same thing happens there. It could get defeated in either of those places, but if it passes both houses, then it goes to the governor. And if it changes from a bill to an act, because it's now passed. So it's now an act, Act number 10, and that goes to the governor. Then the next step is for the governor to either sign it or veto it, or he can partial veto it. He can make certain changes before he signs it. If he signs that act, then it used to go to the Secretary of State's office, and we would then schedule publication in the newspaper for that act. And we had a 10-day window to do that under the law. So we would publish the act, and when it's published, the day after it's published, it becomes law. And at that point, it becomes a law, not an act, and it would go into the statutes. Under whatever statute that law applies. Quite a process.
Yeah.
All right, so our final question is, what do you believe is the biggest problem facing the youth today?
I saw that question, and I'm not sure how to answer it because there's lots of problems. I think the biggest one that we sort of hear about is the issue of the cost of education and the student loan issue, where students graduate from college and they owe $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. If they want to go to medical school or law school, it could be $100,000. So I think that's a real critical problem. And when I went to college, it was a few $100s, and I was able to work a part-time job and pay my tuition. So I think that's a real big issue. I think that the cost should not be a deterrent for education. Any young man or woman who makes good grades and is willing to work should be able to go to school, whether it's a technical school, whether it's a university. And we need to find a system to make that possible without having to borrow thousands of dollars. I guess the other problems are pretty obvious. I mean, we have a great disparity of income in this country now. It's worse now than it was at the time of the Depression. So even if you get a job, you may not earn enough money to do the things you need to do, because the average worker's salaries have gone down actually in the last 10 years. And most of the money has gone to very, very rich people. So that difference between the average person, what we call the middle class sometimes, the average working person, has become very difficult for them if they want to have a normal life and get married and buy a house or whatever. So I think those are the two things I can think of that are problems for young people today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It was a pleasure to meet you and to do this program for you.